For this chapter, we're going to go over the blood vessels. And when we talk about blood vessels, the first thing to know is that they are the delivery system of dynamic structures, and they begin at the heart. So that's where the highest blood pressure would be. And they extend to the capillaries, and then it's returned to via the veins to the heart. So the first three main categories of blood vessels are arteries, and the key thing to remember for arteries are that they carry blood away from the heart, and that is always true. And they're usually oxygenated. However, that's not true for the pulmonary circulation and the umbilical fetus or umbilical vessels of the fetus. So, for example, as you learned in the last chapter, the pulmonary artery branches off of the pulmonary trunk and it carries deoxygenated blood. So that's one exception. The other artery is the umbilical artery, which also carries deoxygenated blood. And it's also the same for the veins as well. So let me just jump down here to the veins. They carry blood towards the heart, so that's the key word to remember, towards. And it's usually deoxygenated, except for, again, pulmonary circulation and the umbilical vessels of the fetus. So the exceptions in this case would be the pulmonary vein. Recall that the pulmonary veins return, so takes blood towards the heart. They take blood towards the left atrium, and it's oxygenated blood. The other exception would be the umbilical vein, which is also oxygenated blood. So those are the two exceptions. Now, in between the arteries and the veins are capillaries, and the capillaries are very unique because they have a direct contact with tissue cells, so they can directly serve the cellular needs. This slide is showing the relationship of blood vessels to each other. So it's kind of like a flow chart, a schematic, and it's showing the lymphatic system as it relates to the circulatory system. And so you'll be learning about it later in another chapter. So let's first look at the blood that comes out of the heart. It's in the arterial system, and the arterial system has two subcategories. The first subcategory is the elastic arteries, and they're also called pressure reservoirs. The next one would be the muscular arteries, also called the distributing arteries, and then that leads to the third subclass of arteries, which is called the arterioles, and they're also called the resistance vessels. Now, I want you to look at something closely here. We'll talk about this later in a future video, but there is an anastomosis that forms here. And anastomoses are present all over the body, from the palms of our hand to the brain to the GI tract, you name it. But they are bypasses that are formed from arteries to veins. So after the arterial system, that leads to the capillaries, which are the exchange vessels. These are going to be the one small vessels that are going to have direct contact with the cells. So after there's exchange of oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, waste, then the deoxygenated blood is returned to the heart. And there's two subcategories of veins. There's small veins and then large veins, so the diameter will increase. And both of them are called capacitance vessels. And what this means is that at any one time, about 60% of the blood in our body is found in the venous system. Our next slide is showing the structure of a blood vessel wall, and there are three main tunics. First of all, the center of the blood vessel is called the lumen, and the three tunics are called the tunica intima, media, and externa, and the capillary only has the endothelium. So let's look a little more closely at the tunica intima and the tunica media. The intima has endothelium, which is simple squamous epithelium, and it is intimate, has intimate contact with the blood, so it's directly touching the blood. And the important part of the endothelium is that it is a very slick surface that reduces friction. And this is important because we don't want red blood cells or anything to attach itself to the blood vessel wall, forming a clot, a possible clot. The next media is the middle one called the tunica media, and it has an abundance of smooth muscle, and this smooth muscle is going to allow for vasoconstriction and vasodilation. This vasoconstriction is important to increase the blood pressure, and vasodilation is important to lower the blood pressure. So it's responsible for maintaining blood flow as well as blood pressure. The outer layer of the wall is the tunica externa, and it's also called the tunica adventitia. And what's important about this is it has loose collagen fibers that their main job is to reinforce the wall, to anchor it, to basically hold everything together. So our next slide is showing a diagram of the arteries, veins, and capillaries. So let's look at the artery first. And the artery has all three layers, the tunica intima, which is the endothelium, the media, which is the smooth muscle, and the externa, which is the outer layer. And now I want you to notice that the vein has three layers as well. It has the tunica intima, the media, and the externa. The big difference is that it also has the presence of valves. And the valves are going to ensure that blood goes in one direction back towards the heart. We then have our capillary, which is where the exchange vessels are. So there can be exchange of oxygen, carbon dioxide, etc., which forms the capillary network. And there are hundreds of capillaries within any single capillary network. Our next slide is showing a graph which is comparing the difference between the makeup of the arteries. So remember that the arteries have three main subcategories: the elastic artery, the muscular artery, and the arteriole. The veins have really two subcategories. There's the venules and then the veins. So let's look at the differences. The average lumen diameter and wall thickness numbers are not important to remember, but what is important to know is the stark differences between them. I'd like you to notice, for example, that within the arteries, there's a lot of smooth muscle. And there's the most smooth muscle in the muscular artery, and there's also some in the arteriole. Whereas if we compare this to the veins, we see very little smooth muscle in the venule, but more in the vein. And what's significant about the larger vein is that it has a lot of collagen, a lot of fibrous collagen, and that is unlike any other. And again, the capillary is very significant because it only has this one layer, the endothelium. So moving on to the arteries now and looking at the three specific ones. So the subcategories, remember, are elastic, muscular, and arterioles. The elastic is the thick-walled artery with large, low-resistance lumens. And the best example of this one would be the aorta. So it's the major branches that come right out of the heart. Also the brachiocephalic trunk, the left common carotid, the left subclavian artery, those high-pressure arteries, which are conducting arteries, and they have to deal with a lot of high pressure changes because of the expansion and the contraction of the heart. So they expand and recoil as the blood is ejected from the heart. And the ejected is the systole phase, remember, of the heart. Our next slide is showing the muscular arteries. And the muscular arteries are also called the distributing arteries. And they have a thinner diameter. You can see here it says they range from a pencil lead size to a pinky finger size in diameter. And they're most of the named arteries that are named for body regions. So one example would be the brachial artery, and then if we think of our forearm, we have the radial artery, the ulnar artery, so those distributing ones. And they play a role in vasoconstriction. Then the third subgroup of arteries is the arterioles. And the arterioles is the smallest of all the arteries. It's going to have the reason that it's important is because it controls the flow of blood into the capillary beds via vasodilation and vasoconstriction. And this happens because of what are called precapillary sphincters. So sphincters that are leading into the capillary beds. And those precapillary sphincters have the ability to constrict, to prevent blood from going into the capillary beds, or to dilate to allow for more blood to go into the capillary bed. And because of this, we also refer to them as resistance arteries. So our capillaries now are our exchange blood vessels. These exchange blood vessels are microscopic. They are so small that only one single red blood cell can pass through, kind of single file can pass through at a time. So it kind of makes sense now to imagine if there is some sort of clot or obstruction in one of those really small blood vessels, that it's going to prevent oxygen from reaching a tissue bed. So the function is the exchange of gases, the nutrients, waste, and hormones between the blood and the interstitial fluid. And there's pulmonary capillaries, and there's also systemic capillaries. But in pulmonary capillaries, the blood is picking up the oxygen and dropping off the carbon dioxide. Whereas it's opposite in the systemic capillaries. In that case, the blood is transferring the oxygen and the nutrients to the tissues, and the carbon dioxide is going from the tissues back into the blood as well as the waste products.